I went down to Mississippi in 1964 with my husband Henry Lorenzi after at least a year of concerted effort to figure out what good thing to do. And we rejected the Peace Corps, and we rejected the American Friends Service Committee, and we couldn't reject, after Birmingham, we couldn't reject the knowing the civil rights movement existed. And it was a groundswell in 1964. It was what many people did. I guess not a huge majority of people, but we joined the civil rights movement. The church bombing in Birmingham was important to both of us in terms of making us see that it was just a terrible thing going on and we needed to help. Okay, this chapter is called Reading the Some People Story and a Trip North. It's reviewing the past and looking ahead. It's in February to April 1967, so this was several years after we started work there. On a pitch dark and cold muddy night, February of 1967, an elections meeting was held in a large paint-peeling wooden church building. I had been asked to write a short piece, something that would take 10 or 15 minutes to read to a group. Its purpose was to set a mood, to call up a feeling in the people gathered that would help them continue in their work and become more united in their strength. Some of the leaders thought that such a piece could help, for this was a meeting that brought together the new coalition committee and the longtime movement members. The leaders felt that the old movement people were tired of the struggle. They needed something to boost them up, remind them of their accomplishments, and help them feel the way to continue. The new people needed something to give them respect for those who seemed slower, the old movement people who were the poor people, the ones, something that would introduce those new people to some of the things that the movement people had done. And the whole group needed something to remind them that they all needed each other to work together. New people needed something to give them respect for those who seemed slower, to introduce them to some of the things the movement people had done. And the whole group needed something to remind them that they all needed each other to work together. The piece I wrote, The Some People of That Place, grew much longer than I intended. Several leaders who read drafts said, "Just start and read until the people get tired." So on the night of the meeting, I carried my papers into the stark, bare-bulbed, nearly empty church and sat warming myself by the orange flame of the open gas heater while people slowly congregated. Despite the bitter cold and the forecast for rain, nearly 100 people turned out for the meeting. They filled the space on the wooden front-facing benches, the side pews usually reserved for church deacons, and the various straight-back chairs and folding chairs up on the platform facing outward toward the congregation. More stood along the bare side and the back walls, and a few sat crowded around the rickety table in the back corner. The opening song was followed by a long prayerful invocation that was followed by another song. Finally, after some announcements and several incidental remarks, I was presented to the body and began to read. It grew very silent in the church, and though the people seemed attentive, there were few of the usual amens and that's rights. I was worried because my rough narrative was a story about them. I realized how bold it was to write down recent history, and even more so to read it to the main history makers whom I referred to as the Some People. Although I had used no names or specific places, nor even spoken specifically about the Black Civil Rights Movement, it was obvious to all what I was describing. I knew that many of them knew better than I what had happened, and each had their own version. My darting glances up from the page only gave me a few rows of faces directly in front of me. The silence told me nothing. Anxiously, I read on for more than an hour. When I finally stopped at the end of the second year of the 4-year tale, I looked up slowly into their intense silence. I noticed one carve-wrinkled old man in mid-center with slumped shoulders and head nodding forward, and a large woman way on the end of the front row, leaning heavily to one side. But I had no time to study on them before a loud voice from the platform behind me broke the silence. A man jumped to his feet. He was shouting in a clear, booming voice. "That there's no story," he stated. It was Hartman Turnbow, and his opinion was important. I could envision the violence with which he was capable of tearing the story, or me, apart. He lifted his muscular arms up towards his chest, and his broad farm-hardened fingers wrestled with the air, as they usually did when he was beginning to warm to his subject. "No, sir," he shouted. There's no story. That's no story at all. That's history." The rest of the congregation broke its silence with foot-thumping, hand-clapping, and loud talking. Some of Turnbow's words were lost in the noise of the others shouting that it was fine, just what they wanted for their grandchildren to read. Several questioned my not using any names, suggesting that every person's name and the names of all the places should be written in a history. I told them I hadn't meant for the story to be the only history written of their movement. I knew much more needed to be written, and many facts had been left out. The full history of those times would come only when some of them would tell their own story. In the end, most agreed with the gray-haired, gentle-spoken man who, in the manner of passing a motion, quite nearly demanded that no matter what else got written, what he had heard that night should be bound up in a book and put inside the county public library, and many copies should be made so each could keep one on a shelf at home for himself and his children and grands to read. I was moved by the reception to my words, and I vowed to remember the wishes of the group. I had no idea it was going to take so long. Not long after I read the Some People's Story aloud at the coalition meeting, Henry and I decided to head north for an extended period of time in order to let the leaders take charge of their own movement. We investigated possibilities for our lives outside of the Freedom Democratic Party, but we also went to fundraise for the coming election effort.